Now here we'll talk about the blood vessels, whether it's the arterial system, venous system, or the capillaries. So the blood vessels are all of them are organs of the cardiovascular system, and they form a closed circuit that transports the blood from the heart to the parts of the body and then back to the heart. And it has to be a closed circuit because if there's any openings, that'll lead to leakage of blood. The different kinds of blood vessels that we have are arteries, and those carry blood away from the ventricles, again, regardless of the kind of blood that is being carried. Arterioles would receive the blood from the arteries and carry it over to the capillaries. Capillaries are the where exchange of substances occur, and then the capillaries will carry blood from the arteriole down to the venules. The venules take the blood from the capillaries and take it all the way or conduct it down to the veins. Now the veins receive blood from the venules and carry it back to the atria of the heart. And here you can take a look at these different blood vessels. So this side is your artery, and that is the vein. Both of them have three different layers, or known as tunics. The tunica externa is connective tissue, and that protects the blood vessels. The middle layer, or the tunica media, is made out of smooth muscle fibers and connective tissue like elastic and collagen fibers. These smooth muscle fibers have the ability to contract and relax, leading to the dilation or constriction of these blood vessels. The third layer is the tunica interna, and that is the endothelial lining, that simple squamous epithelium lining that is continuous with the endocardium of the heart. You can see here, comparing an artery to a vein, that the tunica media in the artery is thicker, and that is because the pressure of the blood inside of the arteries is higher. So these are your high pressure vessels. While on the venous side, the smooth muscle layer is thinner because these are low pressure vessels. And veins have valves, arteries do not have valves. Now for the arteries, again, these are thick, strong wall. They're thicker than the walls of the veins because, again, they function under higher pressures. The three layers, we have the tunica interna, that's the innermost layer, or also known as the endothelium. There's the tunica media, made out of the smooth muscle fibers and elastic tissue, and that elasticity allows for the blood vessels to, distend in order to take all of that blood that is being pumped from the heart into these arteries. And then the tunica externa, that is the outer layer made out of connective tissue for protection. Again, the arteries transport blood under high blood pressure, and they give rise to smaller arterioles. Now, the smaller arterioles, these are going to keep on losing some of the smooth muscle fibers and some of the tunica externa until you reach the very small arterioles that right before your capillaries, where you can see here that the smooth muscle fibers are very minimal, but they still, again, have the ability to contract and dilate the arterioles. And right before a capillary, each one will give what is known as a precapillary sphincter. That is the last of the smooth muscles. The capillaries do not have any smooth muscles at all, but the precapillary sphincters are what controls the amount of blood going into the capillaries. So our capillaries are not open all the time. Sometimes we do not need blood going through all of the capillaries, so these precapillary sphincters are contracted, meaning that the capillaries can be empty and devoid of blood. When needed, let's say during exercise, we need more blood to come into different areas, so the precapillary sphincter will relax, allowing blood to get into the capillaries. Now for the capillaries, those are the smallest diameter blood vessels. They connect your arterioles to the venules, and they are basically just that endothelial lining, just that simple squamous epithelium that has extended throughout the whole system. They are semi-permeable, and they're regulated. The amount of blood going through the capillaries are regulated by the precapillary sphincters that we talked about. And again, the capillary will take the blood from the arteriole over to the venules. Here you can see a structure of the capillary made again out of the simple squamous epithelial cells with their little slits or pores in between the cells, allowing for the passage of substances. And the permeability of capillaries varies. So areas in the, for example, the kidneys, where you want lots of things to be filtered out in order to make urine, you'll find that these slits are much bigger than in other areas, for example, in the brain, where you don't want lots of filtration happening. For the capillary arrangement, our organs are different in how many capillaries they have. So the higher the metabolic rate of the tissue, you would have a denser capillary network. And so, for example, you'll find skeletal muscles and nervous tissue are very rich in their capillary supply in order to provide them with large amounts of oxygen and nutrients, while things that have low metabolic rate, like cartilage, for example, these are going to have fewer capillaries, and that makes it actually a lot harder for them to heal if they are injured. Now, capillary exchange means that the exchange of material that happens at the levels of the capillaries. So there are exchange of gases, nutrients, and metabolic waste products. All of these exchanges happen at the level of the capillary. So basically your arteries, arterioles, venules, and veins are there for either to, take blood to the capillaries or away back to the heart. All of the action happens at the level of the capillaries. So how do these exchanges occur? Of course, by three different methods, either diffusion, filtration, or osmosis. So diffusion, and that is the most important method of transfer, that diffusion, if the products are, or if the chemicals are lipid soluble, they can diffuse through the cell membrane. While if the chemicals are water soluble, they cannot diffuse through the cell membrane, but they would have to go through these membrane channels or the slits that we talked about that are found in between the cells. Filtration happens due to hydrostatic pressure. And that hydrostatic pressure will push things through the slits. Okay, the hydrostatic pressure is derived from ventricular contraction. So you kind of want to think of the capillaries as that garden hose connected to the spigot. So if you open up the water and there is a higher hydrostatic force, that is going to push more water out of those little slits. Well, if you turn down the water a little bit, the filtration of the hydrostatic pressure is lowered and the filtration becomes less. So that's exactly what happens when the ventricles contract. Due to the hydrostatic force or hydrostatic pressure, that is going to lead to filtration of things through the capillary slits. So the hydrostatic pressure is derived from ventricular contraction. Now, these two forces, diffusion and filtration actually pushes things out of the capillary. Osmosis actually opposes filtration. So osmosis is the ability to pull water into the capillaries, and that is due to the solutes that are unable to leave the capillaries, like these big plasma membranes. Those remain inside of the capillaries. They're too big to be filtered out of the slits, and they are important to maintain the osmotic pressure inside of the capillaries. And it's because of that osmotic pressure, it'll draw water pull water into the capillaries. So again, osmosis, or the osmotic pressure, opposes the filtration. And here you can see what is happening in the capillary exchange. So that right here is your capillary. These are the interstitial fluid. This is your arterial end, and that's the venous end of the capillary. The osmotic pressure is constant throughout the whole capillary, so the amount of plasma protein remains constant. Osmotic pressure on the arterial end is equal to the osmotic pressure on the venous end. What does change, though, is the hydrostatic pressure. So the hydrostatic pressure on the arterial end is a lot higher than the hydrostatic pressure on the venous end. So on the arterial end, you have hydrostatic pressure pushing things out of the capillary, while you have the osmotic pressure trying to pull water back in. Your net product on the arterial end would be net outward pressure. So what is happening on the arterial end would be net filtration of things from the capillary. While on the venous end, although you still have the two pressures in place, the hydrostatic and the osmotic, but your net pressure would be inwards. So on the arterial end, you're pushing things out into the interstitial tissue, while on the venous end of the capillary, you are gathering the waste products back in to the venous end, and then again, that blood flow will end going to the venule. So on the arterial end of the capillary, water and other substances leave the capillary because your hydrostatic pressure is higher than the osmotic pressure. While on the venular end of the capillary, the opposite happens because osmotic pressure is higher than the hydrostatic pressure. So these concepts are extremely important, so please make sure that you're very comfortable with them. Now for the venules, these will receive blood from the capillaries and transport them to the veins. We are going to start to build up again the tunica media and the tunica externa, but they are still thinner than your arterioles. Now the veins, that will gather the blood from the venules. We have the three layers, but again, the tunica media is less developed than what we have seen in the arteries because these blood vessels are low pressure vessels. They're known to carry blood under relatively low pressure compared to the arteries. They actually function as blood reservoirs. So we will see in the next slide how the majority of the blood is pretty much stored in the venous circulation. A lot of the veins have these valves, and that is because if you take a look at your lower limbs and upper limbs, that venous blood has to really go against gravity. So you want these valves to prevent the regurgitation or the return of blood downwards, again, because those would have to be pushed upwards towards the heart. And this is where you can see the distribution of the 5 liters of blood. So remember, on average, an average adult has about 5 liters of blood. You will see that 60 to 70% of it is found within the venous circulation. So again, your veins are really blood reservoirs. So about 2/3 of the blood is in the veins and venules at any given time. The distribution of the other things, so about 10% roughly, would be in the lungs, heart, and the systemic arteries each. And then about 4 to 5% is found within the capillaries. Now, these are some blood vessel disorders, and a couple of them we already discussed. So atherosclerosis was discussed previously, but it is the deposition of the cholesterol plaques that occur in the inner lining of the arteries. So these atherosclerotic plaques are going to make the endothelium lining rough, and that again can lead to the formation of a blood clot. This right here is an aneurysm where you have a bulge in the wall of the artery. Okay, and that happens when the blood pressure, kind of dilates and weakens the certain areas of the vessels, and it usually happens where blood vessels start to branch off. These are kind of like the weakest parts, and these aneurysms can, under pressure, they can burst, leading to bleeding. Phlebitis is the inflammation of a vein. So you can see that inflammation of a vein is a common disorder, and it usually it's kind of corresponding or happens hand in hand with the last of the disorders that we'll talk about, which are varicose veins. So varicose veins are the abnormal and irregular dilation of superficial veins, where we can now see them through the skin. So you can see these varicose veins in the lower limbs, and they're most common in the legs. And this ends this portion.